Hey y'all, my name's Amanda and today I'm going to give you some tips on how to learn to knit if you already know how to crochet. My first piece of advice is to learn how to knit continental style, which is different from English style. In continental style, you hold the yarn in your left hand, just like you do in crochet. This was a big help when I was teaching myself to knit. And the best website I found for videos on learning continental style was knittinghelp.com. I will link that below. The next piece of advice I would give you is to go slow. Go very slowly when you're learning to knit. Knitting is inherently slower than crochet for most people anyway, just it's a slower craft. It takes longer to make something in knitting than it does in crochet. So you also need to be patient with yourself and go very slowly when you are learning to knit. You will be nervous about the stitches slipping off the ends of the needles because the crochet hook sort of prevents that from happening. And if you go more slowly, then it will definitely help. My next tip is to learn to knit on circular needles, even if you are not working in the round. If you are knitting a flat piece like a dishcloth or a scarf, you can still knit those on circular needles. And there are lots of tutorials on how to do that, but two pieces of advice I will give you is to always make sure that at the beginning of a row, the needle with the yarn on it, with the yarn coming off the back of it, is in your left hand at the beginning of a row. And just basically pretend that the cord between the two needles isn't there and just switch the needle that has the yarn on it from your left hand to your right hand as you finish the row. I would also recommend, as far as casting on, that's something that a lot of people struggle with when they're learning to knit. I would recommend that if you already know how to crochet, that you do a long tail cast on. And in that cast on, you hold the yarn again in your left hand, and it's much easier to learn if you know how to crochet. Next tip is to learn to master the knit stitch and the purl stitch first before you try to do anything else. And I would even recommend learning one at a time. Just master the knit stitch and then master the purl stitch. You can do this by practicing stockinette, which is one row of knitting all the way across, turn your work, and then one row of purl all the way across. That's where I would start. And again, just go very slowly. I would also recommend that you learn very early on to fix dropped stitches. That is something that I really was scared of when I first started teaching myself to knit, was that these stitches were going to slide off the end of the knitting needle and I wouldn't know how to fix it. Going slowly helps with this, and if you also know how to fix the stitches, it will give you more confidence that if that does happen, it's not that big a deal. You can actually fix dropped stitches with a crochet hook, and that made me even more comfortable knowing that I could fix it with the crochet hook as opposed to trying to learn how to do it with the needles. Another thing about drop stitches in knitting is you don't have to undo your work all the way back to the mistake like you do in crochet to fix if you make an incorrect stitch or you lose a stitch. In knitting, you can just fix it even if it's several rows below. Next tip is to learn a little bit about the difference between knitting and crochet when it comes to tension. In crochet, your tension is built on the stitch you are currently working on, so the stitch that you are currently stitching needs to be not too tight, not too loose. In knitting, what you are actually working on, the stitch that is actively being knit or purled or whatever it might be, is going to feel very loose if you are used to crocheting. The tension actually happens a few stitches after the stitch that you're working on, and once you get the hang of it, you'll see what I'm talking about. But the stitch that is actually on your needle, on your needles that you're actively working, is going to feel really loose if you're used to crocheting. That was a big problem that I had when I first started to teach myself, is I was working so tightly because I was trying to maintain my tension on the stitch I was actively working on. Keep in mind that the first row is going to be the hardest to knit into. Those stitches are going to feel really tight compared to the rest of your work. So if you're just learning, don't get too frustrated if the first row seems really difficult. It will get easier as you move past the first row. After you cast on, the stitches that are on the needle are a little harder to work into. If they're really hard to work into, if you can't get the needle in there, then you've cast on too tight. So I would recommend taking those off and making those looser instead of just trying to fight with it. I would also recommend starting with needles that aren't too small. I would say at least a size 8. and to use just worsted weight yarn. Don't try to make a sock or anything like that as your first project. It's just too small and it's hard to get the hang of it. It also helps if you learn to sort of read your knitting early on, to be able to look at the stitches you've done and see which are knit stitches, which are purl stitches. Also, another tip is that a knit stitch and a purl stitch, if you look on one side of your work, it's going to look like a knit stitch. If you flip it over and look at the back of that stitch, it's going to look like a purl stitch. So it's the same stitch. One looks like a knit stitch, on one side and a purl stitch on the other side. So that helps you sort of read your work as well. The knit stitches and purl stitches look distinctly different once you kind of recognize how they look. And you can also learn to count your rows, so like counting up your work to see what row you're on. I recommend trying to get the hang of that pretty early on as well. And my last piece of advice is, whenever you're getting ready to set your project down and come back to it later, try to do that at the end of a row if at all possible. It makes it easier to pick up where you left off, and make sure that you're not switching the needles in your hands and accidentally starting with the wrong needle in the wrong hand. I also recommend using needle tip covers whenever you stop your project to come back to it later, so that the stitches don't slide off the ends of the needles. So there you have it. Those are my tips for learning to knit if you already know how to crochet. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, I'd love it if you could give it a thumbs up and would consider subbing before you exit my channel. Thanks for sticking with me. Hope to see you next time. Bye.